Vesper marched into our living room with a box under her arm and a condescending smirk she mistook for kindness. She didn't offer the television as a gift. She offered it as a verdict, implying my current screen was as obsolete as my own mind. I leaned back, my hands steady on the armrests, watching her perform the charade of the helpful daughter-in-law. Young people believe that stillness is a sign of decline, forgetting that a tiger is most dangerous when it is motionless. She spoke to me in short, simple sentences, as if my 4 decades of engineering experience had evaporated the moment I retired. I let her talk, noting the way she avoided eye contact with the safe hidden behind the painting of the harbor. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. I have navigated storms that would have swallowed her whole, and I wasn't about to be shipwrecked by a girl who couldn't even hide her greed. Vesper's movements were frantic, her fingers fumbling with the HDMI ports while she cast long, hungry glances at my desk. I watched her reflection in the window, seeing the exact moment she slipped a small, black disc into the vent of the new television. She finished the installation with a theatrical sigh, patted my shoulder as if I were a prize-winning poodle, and made a quick exit. I waited until her car cleared the driveway before I stood up, my movements deliberate and powerful. Aloan walked into the room, her expression as sharp as a diamond, already knowing that the trap had been set. I reached behind the screen and felt the cold plastic of the bug she had planted to spy on our private lives. She wants to listen to our secrets, so we are going to tell her exactly what she needs to hear to destroy herself. I looked at the tiny device in the palm of my hand, a piece of technology no bigger than a coat button, meant to turn our sanctuary into a stage. It's ironic, really, that Vesper thinks she's a digital ghost, yet she left a greasy thumbprint on the plastic that I could see without even reaching for my reading glasses. I tried to use the new voice-activated remote to mute the screen, but the television ignored my command and instead insisted on loudly announcing the current weather in Singapore. I stood there, effectively losing an argument to a piece of glass, while Aloan watched from the doorway with that patient look she uses when I'm being outsmarted by a kitchen appliance. We didn't speak a word about the bug. We didn't need to. We've been married long enough that our silence is a fully formed language with its own complex punctuation. I gently replaced the device exactly where she'd tucked it, making sure it had a clear ear to the dining table where we usually discuss our finances. It's a strange feeling, knowing your own home has been drafted into a war you didn't start, but I found the tactical challenge strangely invigorating. I checked the batteries in the remote twice, mostly to give my hands something to do while my mind rewired the room into a psychological minefield. Vesper thinks she's listening to 2 relics waiting for the end, but she's actually tuned into a frequency she isn't equipped to handle. I poured Aloan a glass of wine, my movements fluid and heavy with intent, as I caught her sharp gaze in the dark reflection of the mahogany cabinet. We sat down, not as victims, but as actors preparing for the opening night of a very expensive performance. I glanced at the safe, then back at the TV, allowing a slow, calculated smile to touch my lips for the hidden microphone to hear. If she wanted a story about a hidden fortune, I was more than happy to give her a masterpiece. I leaned in toward the sensor and sighed with a precision that would make a professional mourner jealous. Tonight, we would start writing the legacy that Vesper so desperately craved, and it would be the most expensive mistake of her life. The room felt different with a spy in the walls, like a theater's seconds before the curtains rise. I sat at the table, engaging in a silent, tactical struggle with a jar of pickles that seemed to have been sealed by a vengeful Greek god. Aloan watched with a faint, knowing smirk as I used a butter knife to break the vacuum seal. A small, triumphant pop followed by a rogue spray of vinegar on my silk tie. I wiped the stain with a dry chuckle, noting that even after a lifetime of solving complex structural failures, a glass jar remains a worthy opponent. We settled into our chairs, our voices pitched with a precision that would make a stage actor envious, designed specifically for the microphone Vesper had hidden. It's a tragedy about Thorn, I began, my tone carrying a weight of simulated, weary disappointment. He has no idea that Vesper pawned the gold watch I passed down to him just to cover her shopping habits. I felt Aloan's gaze sharpen. We weren't just improvising. We were finally labeling the small, calculated thefts she thought were invisible to us. The air in the room grew heavy with the truth of her betrayal, a cold realization that trust had been traded for plastic vanity. She treats our history like a garage sale, assuming we are too dim-witted to notice the gaps on the shelves or the missing heirlooms. I leaned back, my hand steady as I adjusted the volume on the television, letting the static create a sense of dramatic tension. I had planned to transfer the deed for the lakeside estate to them next month, I whispered, ensuring the bug caught every syllable. But a woman who sells her husband's legacy doesn't deserve to inherit his future. My reflection in the dark glass was that of a man who was no longer just waiting, but actively hunting. I could almost feel the static crackle with her sudden, greedy breath on the other end of the line. The first hook was deep in her jaw, and now I only had to wait for her to pull. I pulled a heavy, leather-bound folder from the bottom drawer, the one that smells of cedar and decades of stubbornness. I accidentally knocked my favorite fountain pen off the desk, and as I watched it roll, I realized that gravity has become much more efficient at its job than it used to be. I retrieved it with a grunt of pure annoyance, not because it was difficult, but because the pen seemed to be mocking my sense of order. Once back in my chair, I spread out a series of old architectural blueprints, knowing they would look like high-stakes legal documents to a greedy amateur. Aloan sat across from me, her knitting needles clicking a rhythmic, steady code that felt more like a countdown than a hobby. "The new codicil is ready," I said, my voice projecting just enough to hit the sensor hidden behind the television. "Since we can't trust the direct line of the family anymore, I've decided to move the offshore accounts into a blind trust for the Historical Society." I watched the signal light on the router flicker, a digital heartbeat of someone recording every word with trembling, excited fingers. Vesper thinks she's eavesdropping on a funeral, but she's actually listening to the opening of a trapdoor. I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee, wondering why the smart mug Aloan bought me seems to think boiling and ice cold are the only two temperatures humans enjoy. It's a small, modern irritation, much like Vesper herself, loud, unnecessary, and ultimately easy to unplug. I tapped the folder with a rhythmic thud, letting the sound echo through the room like a judge's gavel. We aren't just protecting our money. We are reclaiming the respect that she tried to turn into a commodity. Every lie I told was a brick in a wall she was currently running into at full speed. I looked at the clock, noting that it had been exactly 12 minutes since I mentioned the secret safe code. I could almost hear the tires of her SUV screaming toward our driveway in the distance. I watched the robot vacuum bang its head against the baseboard for the fourth time, a pathetic little machine trying to map a room I've known for 30 years. It is marketed as intelligent, yet it treats a simple rug like an impassable mountain range. I suppose it has a lot in common with our daughter-in-law. Vesper views us with that same mechanical detachment, as if we are just static obstacles to be cleared before she can reach the charging station of our estate. She thinks my memory is a sieve, conveniently forgetting that I am the one who designed the very structural systems she now tries to circumvent. It is a special kind of insult to be treated as a ghost while you are still breathing the same air, but I refuse to let her arrogance sink my shoulders. I sat down, my posture rigid, and accidentally leaned against the remote, which instantly triggered a documentary about apex predators at a deafening volume. I didn't scramble or fumble with the buttons. I simply let the booming voice of the narrator explain how the hawk circles its unsuspecting target while I stared directly at the hidden microphone. "Aloan," I said, projecting over the sound of a screeching eagle. It's a shame Vesper is so focused on the silver, because she's completely missed the offshore bonds. I saw Aloan's eyes flash with a cold, appreciative amusement as she adjusted her knitting, her needles clicking like a countdown. We are not just protecting a bank balance. We are defending the dignity she tried to turn into a bargain. I let a dry, sharp chuckle escape my throat, a sound of pure control that I knew would be haunting her headphones right now. Let her listen to the wildlife. Soon enough, she will realize she is the one at the bottom of the food chain. The front door handle rattled with a frantic, desperate energy, as if someone were trying to break into a burning building. I didn't turn my head, but I felt the cold draft of the hallway as Vesper burst in, her polite mask finally shattered by the weight of her own greed. Vesper stood in the foyer, her chest heaving as if she'd run a marathon rather than just driven 10 minutes in a climate-controlled SUV. Her hair, usually a stiff helmet of hairspray, was slightly unraveled, giving her the frantic look of a cornered bird of prey. Earlier, I'd spent 10 minutes wrestling with a smart thermostat that insisted 68 degrees was too cold for my demographic. But looking at Vesper's flushed face now, I felt perfectly chilled. I didn't stand. I stayed rooted in my chair, the heavy silence of the room acting as a physical barrier she couldn't quite cross. "Vesper," I said, my voice as dry as old parchment, "you look like you've seen a ghost, or perhaps just a bank statement you weren't meant to find." She tried to stammer something about forgetting her keys, her eyes darting toward the television where her little black secret was still listening to her own failure. It is a profound, internal breakage to realize that the person your son chose to build a life with views your existence as a technicality standing between her and a paycheck. I felt a cold, hollow space open up in my chest, not of fear, but of a final, irrevocable disappointment. I've built skyscrapers that stood against earthquakes, yet here was a girl whose greed was threatening to tear down the only foundation that actually mattered: family. She took a step toward the mahogany desk, her movements jerky and desperate, a far cry from the sleek helpfulness she'd displayed an hour ago. I watched her with the clinical detachment of a surgeon, observing the precise moment her lies began to collapse under their own weight. "The lakeside property is off the table," I stated, the finality of the words hitting the air like a lead weight. She froze, the realization that her eavesdropping had just cost her millions visible in the sudden paleness of her face. There is no anger like the quiet, calculated fury of a man who has seen everything and expected better. I didn't need to raise my voice. The sheer weight of her betrayal was loud enough to fill the entire house. She opened her mouth to scream a defense, but the look in Alohan's eyes silenced her more effectively than any gag ever could. I felt the air in the room grow thin as the real interrogation was about to begin. Vesper stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, trying to find a lie big enough to swallow the truth. I noticed she'd accidentally stepped on the robot vacuum, which was now chirping a pathetic SOS from under her designer heel, a fitting duet for two machines hopelessly out of their depth. I once spent 3 days in a collapsed tunnel in the 70s, breathing through a straw and waiting for the light, so her frantic gasping didn't move me in the slightest. "You're wondering how I knew?" I said, my voice steady enough to balance a glass of water on. I reached over and picked up the small, black bug I'd already removed from the television and placed on the coffee table, letting it glint under the lamp. The look on her face wasn't shame. It was the pure, unadulterated terror of a thief caught with the jewels still warm in her pocket. I've seen men lose everything on a single bad bet, but Vesper had bet against two people who had already survived the worst life could throw at them. I felt a sharp twitch in my hand, not from age, but from the sheer effort of holding back a dry, mocking laugh at her staggering incompetence. "You thought we were a pair of fading portraits," I continued, "but we are the ones who built the gallery you're standing in." She tried to reach for the device, a desperate, clumsy lunge that I bypassed by simply moving it 3 inches to the left without even shifting my weight. It's funny how the younger generation thinks speed is the same as power, forgetting that the mountain doesn't have to move to win the fight. I looked at Alohan, who remained as still as a frozen lake, her silence far more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. My role here was done. I had laid the groundwork and exposed the rot for everyone to see. I leaned back and folded my arms, the cold satisfaction of the trap finally closing around our daughter-in-law's throat. "I think you've heard enough from me tonight." "Vesper," I whispered, shifting my gaze to my wife. "Alohan hasn't said a single word since you burst through that door, and that is exactly why you should start praying."
I watched Vesper's pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat like a trapped moth against a windowpane. She was waiting for me to scream, to weep, or perhaps to offer her a glass of water to soothe her manufactured hysteria. I simply sat there, my knitting needles resting in my lap, having just dropped a stitch, not out of shock, but because the sheer absurdity of her outfit demanded a moment of silent critique. She was wearing the pearls I'd misplaced last Christmas, glowing against her skin like tiny, stolen trophies. It's a curious thing to realize the woman your son loves is essentially a common shoplifter with better hair. My silence began to fill the room, thick and suffocating, until the only sound was the frantic tapping of her manicured nails against her leather clutch. I've spent 30 years as a head librarian. I know exactly how to weaponize quiet until it forces a confession. Vesper finally broke, her voice a shrill, jagged thing that cut through the dignified atmosphere of our home. She began to lie, about the bug, about the will, about her intentions, each word a clumsy attempt to stitch her reputation back together. I didn't interrupt her, even when she claimed she was only checking the television for safety hazards. I merely looked at Cyprian, who was watching her with the same tired amusement one might show a toddler trying to hide a stolen cookie behind their back. I stood up, my spine a straight line of uncompromising steel, and walked toward her with a deliberate, slow grace. I noticed a smudge of dirt on my Persian rug from her boots, a small mess that would be far easier to clean than the one she'd made of her life. "Vesper," I whispered, my voice a soft velvet over a blade, "you shouldn't have worn those pearls tonight." The blood drained from her face as she realized I wasn't just talking about jewelry, but about every boundary she had ever crossed. I reached out and adjusted the collar of her coat, my fingers grazing the cold, hard evidence of her greed. The true weight of what I knew was about to crush the very air out of this room. Vesper's hand flew to the stolen pearls, her fingers trembling against the silk of her own ego. She looked at me, searching for a spark of grandmotherly forgiveness, but she found only the cold reflection of a woman who had outlived far better villains than her. Behind her, Cyprian was calmly trying to navigate the smart menu on the new television, accidentally activating a voiceover for the visually impaired that began to describe the room's decor in a monotone British accent. He muttered something about modern technology being designed by people who clearly hate their parents, but he didn't look up. His focus was a fortress. I didn't smile, though the sight of my formidable husband being bullied by a remote control was a private, grounding comfort. "You think we are easy targets because we don't post our lives on the internet, Vesper," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, velvet calm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled receipt from a high-end jeweler downtown, dated 3 weeks ago. I had been watching the bank accounts and the inventory of our safe long before she decided to turn our living room into a wiretap stage. It wasn't just the pearls, it was the silver flatware, the antique coins, and the dignity she thought she could sell by the gram. Vesper started to babble about market fluctuations and temporary loans, her excuses falling like lead weights onto the hardwood floor. I watched her, wondering at what point the woman my son married had been replaced by this frantic, hollow shell. Cyprian finally gave up on the technology and simply unplugged the television from the wall, the sudden silence more deafening than any shout. "The smart TV was a clever delivery system for your greed," I noted, "but did you really think I wouldn't notice the keystroke logger you installed on our home computer?" I saw the moment the last of her confidence evaporated, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth of her betrayal. Vesper's phone began to vibrate on the mahogany table, a frantic rhythmic buzzing that signaled Thorne was finally calling back after reading the documents I had emailed him this morning. The phone buzzed on the table, dancing a frantic little jig toward the edge of the mahogany. Vesper reached for it like a drowning woman reaching for a piece of driftwood, but I placed my hand over the screen with a firmness that surprised even me. In the background, Cyprian was squinting at the coffee maker, which had started a descaling cycle at the worst possible moment, filling the room with a rhythmic, gurgling hiss. He whispered an apology to the air, looking utterly betrayed by a machine that was supposed to make his life easier, but was instead providing a soundtrack for our family's collapse. I looked back at Vesper, whose eyes were fixed on the caller ID, Thorne, mobile. "He isn't calling to rescue you, dear," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as a marble floor. "He's calling because I sent him the video from the camera you didn't find, the one hidden in the frame of the mirror where you were admiring those stolen pearls." Her face went a shade of gray that I had previously only seen on old oatmeal. She tried to pull her hand away, but I held the phone down, making her watch the name flash over and over. It is a terrible thing to witness the exact moment someone realizes their future has been erased by a single, recorded gesture. I felt a surge of cold, protective adrenaline, The kind that only comes when you realize the person you invited into your family has been trying to loot the foundation. Cyprian finally won his battle with the coffee maker, though he accidentally splattered a drop of foam onto his cardigan and swiped at it with a grumpy, precise efficiency. He didn't look at Vesper. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes about whether we were ready for the next move. "I've already changed the gate codes," he noted dryly, "and the security company is waiting for my signal." The air in the room felt electrified, a storm that had been brewing for months finally breaking directly over her head. Vesper's phone went silent for a second before starting again, more insistent, more desperate. I slid the phone toward her, not to let her answer, but to let her see the message notification that popped up right after the missed call. Vesper's eyes locked onto the screen, reading the single sentence from Thorne. "I'm at the lawyer's office with the original jewelry appraisals." The color didn't just leave her face, it seemed to leave her soul, leaving behind a hollow, trembling mannequin of a woman. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded, feeling the ancient, heavy silence of a house that had just been purged of a poison. Behind me, Cyprian was having a quiet, dignified argument with the smart lighting system, which had decided that this dramatic moment required a festive disco strobe effect. He clicked his tongue in pure, unadulterated annoyance, muttering about how he could build a bridge across the bay but couldn't convince a light bulb to stay a warm white. He finally gave up and just unscrewed the bulb with a sharp, decisive twist, plunging the corner of the room into a much more appropriate shadow. I looked back at Vesper, who was now clutching her throat as if the stolen pearls were actually beginning to choke her. "Greed is such a loud, messy emotion, Vesper," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet filling every corner of the room. "It makes you forget that the people who built the world you're trying to steal are still the ones who hold the blueprints." I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, weary clarity that the family tree needed this specific, painful pruning. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling like a newborn calf's, her arrogance completely dissolved into a puddle of panic sweat. I watched her, not with pity, but with the clinical interest of someone observing a structural collapse they had predicted months ago. "We aren't just your husband's parents. We are the guardians of a legacy you weren't nearly clever enough to dismantle." Cyprian moved to the door, his presence a physical wall that she had no hope of scaling. She looked toward the window, her eyes darting like a trapped bird, but the sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires told us the police and Thorne had arrived. The blue and red lights began to pulse against the curtains, turning our living room into a cold, rhythmic crime scene before a single hand was even laid on the door. Vesper's knees finally gave out, and she sank onto the edge of the ottoman, her hands covering her face as if she could hide from the reality of the sirens. Cyprian walked toward the foyer to meet them, but he stopped to engage in one last battle with a smart doorbell app on his phone, which was stubbornly showing him a high-definition feed of his own forehead instead of the front porch. He muttered a sharp, dry remark about the unnecessary complexity of a simple brass hinge, while I watched the woman who had tried to hollow out our lives finally crumble into a terrified silence. This was the threat she had never truly calculated, not just the loss of a potential inheritance, but the total, permanent erasure of her place in this family. I stood by the window, my reflection ghost-like against the dark glass, realizing that victory in this house often smells like cold rain and profound disappointment. "You thought our silence was a sign of fading, Vesper," I said, my voice cutting through her sobbing like a diamond through glass, "but it was actually the sound of us deciding exactly how to handle your exit." The front door finally clicked open, Cyprian having clearly abandoned the digital interface in favor of a traditional, reliable physical key. I heard Thorne's voice in the foyer, a heavy mix of heartbreak and a cold, hard clarity that he had inherited directly from his father's bloodline. I felt a fleeting, sharp pang of regret for my son, who had to witness his wife being exposed in the very pearls she had stolen from his own mother's dresser. But I did not move to comfort her. The time for soft hands and easy grace had ended the moment she planted that microphone in our sanctuary. We stood our ground, two pillars of a history she had tried to rewrite, watching the wrecking ball she'd swung finally come back to strike her. I straightened my cardigan, the fabric crisp and orderly, mirroring the absolute state of my mind as the authorities entered. I saw Thorne step into the light, his face a mask of unyielding stone, and I realized that the secret I was still holding back might be the one thing that finally breaks him. Thorne walked past Vesper without a single glance, his focus entirely on the velvet jewelry box I had placed prominently on the dining table. The officer stood by the mahogany door, a silent, official shadow in our living room, while Vesper's sobbing became a rhythmic, grating noise that felt entirely performative. In the corner, Cyprian was attempting to display the digital evidence on his tablet, but he accidentally activated an accessibility mode that turned the entire screen a blinding neon pink. He didn't fumble or curse. He merely tilted the device toward the light and remarked dryly that if the law was blind, this color was surely enough to restore its sight. He finally stabilized the screen, showing the clear, high-definition footage of Vesper's hand inside our private safe, her face illuminated by greed. "It's all here, Thorne," I said, my voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of the room. The pawn tickets, the audio logs from her television project, and the footage from the mirror she thought was just for vanity. Vesper made one last, desperate lunge for Thorne's hand, her voice a shrill plea for a forgiveness she hadn't earned, but he recoiled as if from a strike. I saw the final spark of his devotion die out, replaced by a cold, structural clarity that proved he was his father's son after all. We are the architects who taught him how to spot a crack in the foundation, and tonight, he was watching his entire marriage collapse into dust. The officer bagged the listening device with a clinical precision, the tiny black bug looking utterly insignificant in the harsh light of the police cruiser's flash. There is a specific, heavy stillness that follows the end of a long war, a moment where the air finally clears and the damage can be measured. I felt no need to raise my voice. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the only exclamation point this story needed. As they led her toward the door, Vesper's gaze snagged on the open floorboard under the mahogany desk, a place she had never thought to look. Her eyes widened with a sudden, icy terror as she realized that the fortune we had been discussing wasn't just a trap, it was a history she was now permanently barred from. The heavy oak door finally clicked shut, sealing the night air and the sirens outside where they belonged. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the echo of Vesper's frantic lies finally fading into the wallpaper. In the corner, Cyprian was glaring at the tablet again, which was now reciting the terms and conditions of its user agreement in a cheery, synthesized voice. He looked at it with the weary disappointment of a man who has built bridges, but cannot defeat a software update. He simply set the device face down on the table, silencing the digital ghost, and turned his attention to Thorne. Our son stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty space where his marriage used to be, his shoulders squared with a newfound, bitter strength. I walked to the mahogany desk and pulled out a single, authentic document, not the trap we had set for Vesper, but the real legacy we had prepared for him. It was a deed, signed and dated years ago, waiting for the moment he would finally see the world with the same clarity we do. Greed is a short-term game played by the desperate, but family is an endurance race that Vesper was never equipped to run. Cyprian approached Thorne, placing a steady, heavy hand on his shoulder, a gesture that said more than any eulogy for a dead relationship ever could. We didn't need to discuss the fake will or the bug. The silence between us was now a clean, solid foundation. I felt the weight of the night lift, replaced by the cool, sharp satisfaction of a home that had been defended and won. My husband caught my eye and gave a small, dry nod of approval, his dignity as unshakable as the walls he'd raised decades ago. We are not just surviving our years, we are mastering them, one defeated adversary at a time. The house was quiet, the air was clear, and for the first time in months, the shadows were just shadows again. We stood together, 3 generations of a line that would not be broken by a stranger's avarice.